Okay, what I wanted to do today is first say a few words about our overall approach to the study, and then walk you through the findings for each of the target groups, and then last share with you a few recommendations and key takeaways. Okay, so the overall goal for the study was to understand how to optimize engagement with three target groups that Jerry mentioned earlier. First, interested citizens, influentials, and government decision makers. For the purpose of this study, we defined interested citizens as those members of the general population who live in urban areas, are interested in either global health or international development issues, and are socially or politically engaged. Influentials are senior members of NGOs, the academic institutions, faith-based organizations, media practitioners, and bloggers who are in a position to influence what policymakers who work on development issues are thinking about and how they form the policies. And lastly, the government decision makers are appointed or elected officials who either form policies around international development or oversee their implementation. Between May and September last year, we've conducted focus groups and surveys with almost 4,000 citizens across the 5 countries: France, Germany, China, the UK, and the US. We've also conducted 88 in-depth interviews with influentials across the 5 countries and 40 in-depth interviews with government decision makers across France, Germany, the UK, and the US. In China, we didn't interview any policymakers, government decision makers, for political sensitivity reasons. So what were the research questions we were interested in? Well, first, we wanted to understand which issues do these 3 target groups consider priorities for developing countries, and how do they view their government's engagement in these issues. We also asked them about the sources that they use to stay informed about development, and who do they think are the main champions for promoting international development and global health. For interested citizens, we also wanted to understand who are they, what is their demographic profile, which activities do they engage in to support development efforts, and what are the barriers and facilitators of that engagement. So the first target group I'm going to be talking about are interested citizens. So who are they, and how many of them do we have across these 5 countries? The shares of interested citizens varied significantly across the 5 countries. The US has the lowest share, 31%. The highest share we found in the UK, 50%, and then the other countries are in between. They are generally better educated than the general population, are equally likely to be men and women, so there's no strong gender bias there. And young people between 16 and 25 are underrepresented. However, that said, the young people, even though there are less of them that are engaged, they tend to be more engaged, so they're more likely to do more things at the same time: volunteer, donate, share information on development online, sign petitions, etc. The issues that interested citizens in the UK named as top priorities for development were access to healthcare, access to education, and poverty. These were not prompted questions, so these were all spontaneous answers. And one point that I would like to make here that is very important, not only for the US, but for all other countries as well. Interested citizens in general are very unfamiliar with the language that the development community is using. So terms like international development, global health, food security mean very little to them, and it creates a huge barrier for their engagement. The US was also a bit specific because the way people understand international development here and what constitutes international development is very different from the other countries. We've heard in the focus groups people saying that, oh, actually, our military interventions in the Middle East are also international development. So as we go through the results, you'll see some differences between the countries, and partially they are a reflection of how people understand development. Interested citizens in all countries, including in the US, are generally very well informed about natural disasters. They have a lot of information on these issues, but on the other hand, they know very little about long-term international development efforts. They are generally not active seekers of information and receive most information from mass media, especially television. Social media, as Jerry mentioned earlier, they are not used very often. The only thing that they are used for is for sharing links to campaigns, to different programs that they're interested in, but not for obtaining information on development issues. On the right-hand side, we see the main individual media that interested citizens in the US quoted as the main sources of information. The New York Times and CNN stand out, and the New York Times, as we will see later, was also one of the main sources that the other two target groups use for this purpose. So what activities do interested citizens engage in to support international development? They prefer activities that are of least burden to them. So activities that require time or a lot of effort, they're not very popular across the countries, including the US. Donating money or sharing information online, it doesn't require a lot of effort. That's what they are on top of the list. On the other hand, we have fundraising or writing to the government that requires more effort, and these activities are not very popular. Why do people engage? There are four main reasons. One is personal connection. If people feel they can connect personally to either a country, or if they know someone from a country, if they've been there, they are much more likely to support efforts that help improve social and economic conditions in those countries. If they see evidence of positive impact of international development, they're also more likely to engage, or if they feel they're making a difference to someone's life, or if an issue resonates emotionally with them. The two key barriers of engagement for all of these activities are lack of time and lack of money. One of the things we asked interested citizens in the survey was, who do you think has the main responsibility for addressing developing challenges? And this was an unprompted question, so they could say anything. Across the West, as well as in China, people said the main responsibility lies with the governments of developing countries. France was an exception, where the largest share of our respondents attributed that responsibility to governments of developed countries. We also asked them about their views of how much their government is currently doing to improve economic and social conditions in developing countries. And here, the US really stands out. We have a quarter of all respondents saying it's too much. And this is partially a reflection of how people understand international development. So we have to keep that in mind. The interpretation of international development also has an impact on people's views on how much impact they think their government has made over the past 10 years. We have 29% in the US saying we've made a big difference, whereas in all the other countries except in China, this percentage is much lower. In China, people also understand international development very differently. Because they consider China a developing country, they believe that all efforts of Chinese government in other provinces of China fall under international development. So these results have to be interpreted with caution. These are the individuals that interested citizens in the US named as current as well as future champions for international development. In general, interested citizens across the countries tended to name national politicians as the best champions, with the exception of the UK, where we had a lot of celebrities mentioned as well. Okay, the second target group that we covered in the study were the influentials. Influentials named a very wide range of issues as those that should be prioritized by developing countries. There was really no consensus, not across the countries, not within the countries. The issues that they named were very closely linked to their professional interests. The ones that were most frequently mentioned in the US are listed there. Across the countries, including the US, they attribute the main responsibility for addressing developing challenges to the governments of developing countries. In terms of the communication channels, they use specialized sources and reports and data from those sources, such as the World Bank and different UN agencies, are by far the most important source for this target group. The second very prominent source are their professional and personal networks. They use them to get insider information as well as to check or vet information that they obtain from other sources. Traditional media are used, but primarily to obtain broader background information that helps them understand development in a broader socioeconomic context. Influentials do not use Twitter, but they do use blogs primarily to obtain alternative views on development issues. Who are the advocates that influentials see as best for international development? Well, across the countries, they named a combination of experts high-profile politicians, religious leaders, and celebrities. In the US specifically, experts and politicians tended to be cited most often. So what individual media do influentials use? The New York Times was one source that appeared consistently across the countries, across the groups, as I mentioned before, as were the World Bank and different UN agencies. These are only the sources that were mentioned most frequently. The full list of sources is available in our full report that is available online. Influentials are very avid users of blogs. As you can see, this list is quite long, and it's probably longer than in the other countries. The ones that are in red are the blogs that were mentioned across the countries. Twitter is not used very often, as I mentioned, primarily for two reasons. First, because information that is communicated via Twitter is very short. And secondly, they don't necessarily trust information communicated via Twitter as much as they do other sources. And the last group that we covered were the government decision makers. Similar to the influentials, there is no consensus in terms of the issues that should be prioritized in international development. The issues that they do name are very closely linked to their individual roles as well as to country context. So if a government as a whole decided to prioritize health or agriculture, the government decision makers are much more likely to name those issues as well. Probably not a surprise. Unlike the influentials, they believe that the responsibility for addressing these challenges should be shared between the governments of developing and the governments of developed countries. For information on development issues, government decision makers rely primarily on their professional and personal networks, either within the organization they work in or within the group of organizations they communicate very often. They also use the World Bank sources, the UN sources, as well as materials from some of the major international development NGOs, such as Oxfam, which again appeared across the countries. Traditional media are used primarily for current news and events, not for development information. And they're also reluctant to use social media, much more than influentials are. Government decision makers across the countries, as in the US, prefer experts to be the spokespeople or the advocates for international development and global health. And they're very skeptical about celebrities. Which sources they use? Again, we see some overlap with the sources that the influentials use. New York Times, again, very prominent and mentioned across the countries. Government decision makers are not frequent users of blogs. Center for Global Development blogs were the only source, blog source, that was mentioned in multiple countries. Twitter is not used at all by this target group. The only few mentions that we had were in France and in the UK, where parliamentarians use them to communicate with their constituents, but not for development purposes. Okay, so what are the key things to remember for each of these three target groups? Well, first, for interested citizens, this group in the US and elsewhere, they really lack information on development as well as the opportunity to become further involved. We've heard so many times in the focus groups people saying, actually, I'm really interested, but where do I find information? How do I volunteer? How do I find information about exchange programs, etc.? They're unfamiliar with the language, as mentioned, and they want to see evidence of impact communicated through personal stories. The other two groups also want to see impact or evidence of impact, but they want data, whereas interested citizens are not interested in data at all. They want to hear from people in the developing countries or from volunteers or people that have been engaged here in the US in supporting these efforts. Government decision makers suffer from information overload. However, they also have unmet information needs. What they want is expert advice on the issues they work on and data. Up-to-date, country-specific, region-specific global data. The influentials are the most diverse group of all of them, and they have very specific information needs. Journalists need broader information that helps them understand development in broader socioeconomic context. Representatives of academic organizations and think tanks need data and detailed analysis of the issues they work on. And bloggers are the most diverse group of all of them. And there's really there are very little they have in common as a group. It's really important to look at them individually. Okay, Okay, this is the last slide, and we have a couple of recommendations here. There are more of them available in the full report on our website. So how do we start better engaging with these three target groups? What are the things we could do? What are the key action points? For interested citizens, these activities should really focus on two main goals. First, to raise awareness and fill the knowledge gaps. How do we do that? Engage with mass media, which are used by this group primarily to obtain this information. We avoid development jargon and use simple, clear, and very specific language. And we communicate impact of international development through personal stories. Secondly, we need to encourage deeper engagement. It's very important to foster interest as well as engagement in development issues at a very early age. Again, in the focus groups, we've heard so many people saying, actually, the reason why I do what I do is because I got interested in primary school or in my local church when I was a kid or through other organizations. So it's really important to bring them in and get them interested as soon as you can. Volunteering and international exchange opportunities create personal connections that are one of the main drivers of people's engagement in development issues. So promoting these opportunities is really important. The other two groups, one of the things that they have in common is they're both looking for more structured, regular, informal ways and channels of engagement with each other. And giving them an online forum, as well as promoting offline opportunities to do that, for them to engage more regularly and in a more formal way, is very important. The influentials also appreciate field trips and personal experience they get from visiting developing countries. So promoting these could be useful as well. And to reach them, we need to engage with specialized sources, trusted mainstream media, as well as the key bloggers that they use to stay up to date with developments in the field. The two other things that are important for government decision makers are provide them with the data from their area, the area that they work in, and help them manage the information overload. Currently, they get so much information that normally their staff will filter in, but very often it's still too much. So providing them with a digest of data from their field and research developments in the field is very important as well, and could help them manage that information overload. So as I said, these are just some of the recommendations, and most of the others are all available in the full report, where you also find a more detailed explanation of the ones that we've seen here.